Thanks for having me. You can see a kind of funny picture here on the screen. There's two of my friends, and there's a big pile of organic waste, and there's a few dumpsters. That's over at the university's physical plant on Floyd Street. We're doing what we call community composting, and we call that Feed the Dirt. I don't know how familiar all of you are with composting, but it's a pretty cool thing. Composting is short for decomposition. Decomposition is a critical part of all ecosystems on this planet. We have consumers and we have decomposers. I think a lot of us are becoming very familiar with the consumption side of sustainability by eating local food, supporting our local farmers, going to the restaurants that we know are serving local food. But we might not all be familiar with the fact that our organic waste has to go somewhere still. Most of the time, our organic waste is going in the trash can. And it's about, by mass, about 30% of most of our waste in the landfill is organic waste. Whether it's food, whether it's yard waste, then your percentage gets much higher when you start considering all of that sort of thing. So, a long time ago, all the decomposition happened naturally. Then cities evolved a little bit, and we started piling up trash in our streets, and it got really smelly, so we developed waste management systems and all these flows of resources to where we just put it in a big pile, and we don't have to think about it anymore. We call it a landfill. They're one of the biggest contributors to global warming. They produce more methane than we produce in carbon dioxide, and methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas. One of the cool things that's actually happening in Louisville with that is that the EPA has partnered with Waste Management to test run a composting facility on Outer Loop. They compost yard waste, some of the yard waste picked up in the city, and then they cover the landfill with the compost, and it absorbs about 90% of the methane that's emitted. So that's really cool. Just to go back a little bit, we can think of composting, and because waste management is doing it, makes sense, is the same thing as recycling. When we put our plastic and our paper into the recycling bin, it supposedly gets broken down, decomposed into its compositional elements, and then reconfigured into a new product. Composting is the same thing, it's just for the food and for the stuff we think is a little less fun to handle because it's not so clean. You break it down, you put it into the soil, and then after a while you take that soil and you put it back into somebody's farm or somebody's garden, and all of a sudden you've got new food, and it's a lot better than it would have been if you hadn't put the compost there. Waste management's doing it a little bit, like I said. They're a good example of industrial composting. This is an example of a compost machine. This is not what waste management uses to my knowledge, but it's kind of cool. This example, you put rotting food at one end with some other stuff, and then this little robot goes through the rows. There's some other things like air holes and moisturizers, and as the robot turns it, the material decomposes with the help of some bacteria and some fungals, and eventually you have a finished product at one end. Pardon?
How long does it take then?
The industrial?
Process.
Yeah, well, composting as a whole can take a very long time or a very short time, depending on your conditions of both the pile and the external environment. This probably doesn't take more than 2 to 3 months because if you've spent this much money on that large machinery, I'm assuming you've also figured out temperatures and particle size of your material and all these various things. I'll get into that in just a little while. Did you have a question?
No, I was just going to say I've heard tell that in these industrial operations they've got it down sometimes between 3 to 5 days. If they've got it worked out neatly enough, they can turn it around that fast. But it's a hugely mechanized process.
It is. It is. And part of the reason that I'm here talking about it is because we've got Waste Management doing something akin to industrial composting with some of the yard waste picked up in the city. And then we have a company called QRS, which just bought out a company you might have heard of called Blue Skies, who is doing something similar to that in Indiana. They pick up the organic waste from some of the restaurants in the city, like Taco Punk, and I think Harvest, as well as a couple other places. One of the things that I like to highlight of an industrial system is that it's not always the most sustainable. And that's kind of what we're learning as we talk about these sustainability topics and find them in our lives. We're thinking now local food instead of industrial food, and so even though industrial composting is a big step forward in managing our organic waste, it's not necessarily the most sustainable model. So local composting, kind of like local food, is kind of where we're trying to go. Breaking New Grounds is an organization that existed in Louisville for almost 6 years, and they were kind of the pioneers, as far as I know, of moving from that industrial model to a smaller scale. They took the coffee grounds from all of the Heine brothers in the city, as well as the spent grain from Brown-Forman Distillery, and mixed it with some wood chips over on 22nd Street, and they produced a compost product. They don't exist anymore. They had a board of directors that included the man who originated this project, Sarah Frischner, who was a part of Metro, Steve Weiss, the president of Dismas Charities. Several other prominent members of our community were involved in Breaking New Grounds, and for various economic and ideological reasons, they no longer exist. Left a little bit of a void, because on one hand we've got industrial composting, which isn't fulfilling all of our needs because there's no compost bin right there. And on the other hand, we have passive composting. This is what most of us are familiar with, because your environmental teacher or your parents or yourself put your stuff in the pile in the backyard and say, well, it's a lot better than throwing it in the trash can, and you're right. This is an awesome step, and there's a lot of really cool guides out there for any of you that are homeowners and are interested in diverting your organic waste away from the landfill. This is a great option, because all you have to do is take the stuff from your kitchen, and that includes your coffee grounds and everything you're chopping up and throwing away, as well as your food scraps off your plate, and you just throw them in the backyard, more or less intentionally. And after a while, it turns back into dirt. Great. However, this is also not the most economical of models, because what you're throwing away is kind of valuable. Just like the paper and the plastic that you throw away in the recycling bin, people are paying money to turn that back into something they sell you later. You know, the plastic and the edges of these tables, to the plastic in my shoes, is made out of that stuff. And you bought the shoes and we bought the tables, so that waste is at some point being converted back into a product that people buy. So, industrial composting, passive composting. We've got the other model, community composting. It's kind of the mid-scale. And what we do is almost the same sort of thing that Blue Skies does. We put buckets and bins in various places where people will have their organic waste, and instead of taking it to southern Indiana, or instead of taking it to our backyard, we take it to Floyd Street at the UofL physical plant. We currently pick up from a few different places, about 6 or 7 different coffee shops, landscaping company, a catering company, a couple of restaurants, a couple of community gardens, root cellar, a lot of individuals, and we're thinking about getting it from the UofL dorms, which Angie is working on. And the cool part about this is all of these places are extremely intentional about where their organic waste is going. They're not paying a company who takes it away and may or may not turn it into something positive or a product that they can sell. They're giving it to us, and what we're doing is, with a little bit of help from the scientific research that's been done, turning it into an extremely rich soil that we give to community gardeners. We give to people who have gardens in their backyards. We start new community gardens with. We give to the gardens on the UofL campus. And at the largest scale, which we envision in the future, we'd be giving it back to local farmers. So that the waste that is coming from local food in the city is actually being given right back to the farmer to basically close that loop of food production. The places highlighted in blue here, just 3 of them, well, 5 if you count the fact that 2 of them had 2 locations, are what we call community drop-off locations. We've got a couple hundred 5-gallon buckets, which we write little instructions on. And we give them to people and tell them to put them in their kitchen and to put their eggs or eggshells and their coffee grounds and their food scraps into, put the lid on it, and when you get tired of it, it's full or it starts to maybe smell, You come and you drop it off at one of those locations, and you know for a fact that we will take it, we will teach students how to compost, we'll compost it, and then we'll give it back to people in the community. So, that's about it. This just started about 6 months ago in its kind of current community iteration. For the 2.5 years prior to that, Brian Barnes started this operation and originally had the intention of taking the university's organic waste from the kitchens and from the cafeterias and diverting it from the landfill, turning it into the soil. UofL decided instead to go with Blue Skies Recycling, one of the industrial models that I mentioned earlier, and they still are with them. But Brian got all these resources and used them with the couple of places that he was getting from, and so now we've kind of maxed out our usage of those dumpsters. They're all full. We have a vermiculture operation, which is where the worms get into the dirt, and that's all full as well. So now we're very interested in doing this again on a new piece of property as a nonprofit organization that kind of really hopefully kickstarts the efforts in Louisville again, as Breaking New Grounds did a few years ago, towards the model of community composting.
I have a question. When you talk about the food scraps, because when I told you I had someone who I lived with who started a composting just in our house, and we had some pretty strict guidelines, and maybe it was just our household guidelines on what we didn't put in there, like we didn't put meat, and we didn't put any oil-based things, So are there what would you give any advice on what to not put in there to mess up, or is there any such thing as messing up a compost?
It depends on your compost pile, and that's one of the things that I didn't exactly get into was the composition of a compost pile. Most people know that you've got browns and greens, carbon and nitrogen containing materials. When waste management composts, they're using primarily yard scraps, if not exclusively yard scraps, which is just like branches and limbs that they've shredded, so on and so forth. When you put that stuff in a pile and wait for microbes and fungus to take it over, your end product is more like a mulch than like a nutrient-rich soil. Although, you think in what's gone in is only what's coming out, so there's not new elements coming out of the air, it's just the wood, which is broken down into smaller pieces of wood. When people throw the food scraps away in your backyard, you've got a whole new element. You've got all these vegetables, you've got these eggshells, you've got these coffee grounds, you've got these meat products potentially, these dairy products potentially, which, as we know, contain all the nutrients that we need to survive, as well as all the nutrients that plants need to grow well. So when you add those things in your compost pile, you're really producing not a mulch, but a real compost, something that is incredibly rich in all of those nutrients and will therefore be really good at growing food. The question is, are there things that I'm not allowed to put in there? Like meat, like dairy, like big pieces of bread. If you have a big compost pile, like for example a 3 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter dumpster, kind of doesn't matter because it's getting so hot so frequently that it will all break down and anything organic is going to decompose. However, if we're putting like 10% meat scraps in there, it would become rancid and there would be lots of rats and owls and that would be bad. But most of the time, the things people are scraping off their plates is like 1% of what's in their bucket. So if you're using one of our buckets at home, kind of try and avoid the meat, but it's not a huge deal. At your home backyard pile, you do not want to throw meat in it. You do not want to throw dairy in it. Probably you don't want to throw bread in it either because all of those things are not only going to attract macro scale life forms, but they are going to slow the breakdown process. You also asked about oil. Oil is a really interesting substance and it kind of coats everything else, which again inhibits the growth of certain bacteria because they don't grow on oil, they grow on rotting food. But if it's 1%, no big deal. If it's 10%, you're kind of stuck. So somewhere between the 1 and 10% is the break point, and it just kind of depends on, again, if you've got a really big pile that's really hot, it doesn't matter. Which is why we call it passive composting, because most of the time when you throw it in your backyard, you don't ever touch it again. You just let it sit, you let it rot, you let it decompose. We are in these dumpsters as you can see by the happy faces there, with shovels and pitchforks, turning them, getting air into them, watering them with a hose, being very actively involved in how the decomposition process is occurring. When you're doing that, you've got a lot higher chance of success in breaking down those other more difficult compounds.
But you could do some modified in your home. I mean, you could get your shovel out there and turn
Yes,
it. I mean,
absolutely.
that's what in my head, what I've always thought. I'm like, oh, I can't just let it sit.
No,
Again.
it really should.
Okay.
And a lot of people have begun selling devices now. I mean, it's been around forever.
Oh yeah, they have those
The
tumblers.
compost tumblers, so that the things you put in is kind of already ready there. And if you've got your own garden, I would kind of recommend you to go with that. Or if you've got a garden down the street or a neighbor that gardens. The purpose of this model is almost for the 80% of us, 90% of us who either don't have a yard big enough for composting, don't want the smell of composting, or don't garden. So this way you know that it's going to go to someone who is gardening, and it will be produced in a very thorough, community